Despite the upheaval, Woodside says the case for Scarborough is strong.
The reservoir has almost no CO2. The train that we propose to build at the Pluto site will be very low emissions intensity. So the product that we're going to offer to customers in Asia will be low cost and low carbon.
But critics say investors have their doubts.
Share price has halved over the last 10 years. This project, I guess, is seen as the last hurrah. And I guess there are other options, but the problem is that Woodside isn't looking at them. It's too focused on Scarborough.
Pressure has been building on the LNG industry for years. Soaring East Coast gas prices have seen local users pay more for gas than foreign customers. What's more, billions have been written off Queensland's LNG plants. What's more, claims there's not enough gas to feed them. At the same time, coal blowouts on many new projects mean it's unlikely taxpayers will see an economic return on the investments for decades, if at all. Small billions have been written off Queensland's LNG plants with claims there's not enough gas to feed them. At the same time, cost blowouts on many new projects mean it's unlikely taxpayers will see an economic return on the investments for decades, if at all.
We saw right down across the industry, including Santos, Woodside and Origin. So they're in a bit of a state of flux at the moment.
Projects mean it's unlikely taxpayers will see an economic return on the investments for decades, if at all.
We saw right down across the industry, including Santos, Woodside and Origin. So they're in a bit of a state of flux at the moment.
While uncertainty about the fate of Scarborough lingers, industry experts say the longer-term trends seem to be clear. They say that even if Scarborough gets up, it's likely to be the last of its kind.
What I don't expect to see is another Gorgon or another Wheatstone. I don't think there's any appetite amongst the Australian producers to invest in a new greenfield LNG project at the moment.
Back in Chinchilla, Jamie Short isn't afraid of change and thinks it'll be some time coming.
We can pretty much sort of roll into any type of new process like hydrogen or solar. We're pretty versatile in that respect. Electrical's electrical. It's not, you can do it pretty versatile in it.
Unlike Australia's gas giants.
Pretty versatile in it.
Rare earths are set to play a big part in technologies from electric vehicles to wind turbines.
Pretty versatile in that respect. Electrical's electrical. It's not, pretty versatile.
Unlike Australia's gas giants.
Rare earths are set to play a big part in technologies from electric vehicles to wind turbines. But with relations between the West and the world's biggest supplier, China, at a low point, efforts to diversify supply have prompted renewed interest in Australia's huge deposits.
Rare earths power this hybrid electric car. For Australia's fledgling rare earths industry, the race is just getting started. The minerals are relatively unknown, but are set to play a big part in the 21st century economy.
You got up this morning, you picked up your phone, you got in your car, maybe you drove past the wind turbine. In all of these slides,
China dominates the trade, accounting for up to 80% of global production, with tensions escalating between Beijing and Washington. Concerns are growing about China's stranglehold in the market.
We think it's risky to put all your eggs in one basket. That's why it's important to have a diversified, resilient, and responsible supply chain for rare earths.
Others are blunder in their assessment. They warn that control of rare earths gives China an economic weapon used against countries in their fight against problems ranging from climate change to foreign threat.
It's cut off supply of rare earths in the past.
The dominance of China in the rare earth industry is fueling calls for the development of alternative supplies for technologies including wind turbines, like these, Australia, which has much of the world's known rare earth reserves.
West
Western Australia has enough in the ground to supply the world for hundreds of years. The big challenge is changing the equation for businesses in the resources and chemical sectors to make it cost effective for them to both mine and process and produce these rare metals.
Despite the calls, Lynas says new Australian entrants will struggle to compete with firms from China, which are heavily backed by the state.
Rare earths are not for the faint-hearted. 30 years ago, the Chinese recognised the value and importance of rare earths and set about really developing not just their resource strategy, but also their downstream industrial strategy.
It's a risk acknowledged by the Biden administration, which commissioned a report that found greater involvement Washington was needed to secure critical mineral supply chains. In February, the US government ordered $40 million to Lynas to build a rare earth processing plant in Texas.
It is for governments as responsible, transparent, diversified supply chains.
Lynas's Amanda McKay said the funding will help level the playing field against Chinese companies, but more assistance will be needed if Australia wants to take advantage of its huge reserves.
The issue of the distortion of the market by having such a dominant position from China, for us to be successful in Australia, probably will require some intervention or support from the government.
Mr. Barry, thanks for watching.
Full in Australia. Full in Australia. Full in Australia. Full in Australia. Full in Australia.
Is banking on boosters to get the UK through this surge. This won't be cancelled for the second year.
Well, there are only 8 more sleeps until Christmas, and it's set to be a nervous wait as COVID case numbers continue to go up. The number of new infections in New South Wales has risen above 2,000 for the first time. The sudden surge has many people taking a cautious approach to avoid being forced to isolate over Christmas.
2,213. It's the highest daily total ever for New South Wales, and it couldn't have come at a more disruptive time.
We're definitely keeping masks on because I don't want to be risking it this close to Christmas. I've not gone to like my Christmas work party just because I'm scared of getting COVID and stuff like that. I'm just going to lay low till Christmas Day, really.
Queues for tests are hours long, and getting results is taking even longer. 63 of today's cases have been confirmed as the Omicron variant, bringing the Omicron total to 185. Nearly a third of the new numbers are from the Newcastle region. 3 pubs there have been newly listed as exposure sites, but the Premier doesn't appear phased. He says rapidly climbing case numbers should come as no surprise.
As we opened up and people were saying, where are the increase in case numbers? Well, we're now seeing that increase in case numbers. It's not time to have knee-jerk responses and close down.
New South Wales Police have charged a 21-year-old man with defrauding the government out of more than $500,000. The man is alleged to be part of a group that applied for grants under a scheme meant to help small business owners who are struggling through the COVID-19 pandemic. Service New South Wales says its detection software picked up more than 8,000 possibly fraudulent transactions.
This is the first of what we think will be a number of arrests. It's quite disappointing that during a pandemic crisis people obviously did fraud. The state government Green
Demand.
obviously did fraud. Pandemic crisis, people would obviously did fraud. The state government Green did fraud. And quite disappointing arrests. It's quite disappointing that during a pandemic crisis, people would obviously did fraud.
The man will face court next month. Ruby Cornish, ABC News, Sydney.
Democrats, the Legislative Council elections were supposed to be a landmark moment in standing up to what they saw as increasing encroachment.
Already being handpicked and selected by Beijing. So whoever gets so-called elected in the coming up election, they will not be representative at all. And all of those who actually receive mandate from the citizens of Hong Kong, they're all being locked up or being charged under national security law right now. So there's actually no one that can actually represent the citizens of Hong Kong right now. So this is basically not a genuine election as we will understand it, and boycotting is the only way to go.
Well, what do you think the voter turnout will be like?
I think the voter turnout will be extremely low this year because I have never actually seen my friends or my colleagues that are still in Hong Kong ever be less interested in an election. We all know that these people who are allowed to run an election is not going to be representative at all because they cannot represent the interests of Hong Kongers. I think from the 2019 district council election and from the primary election that is being held by the Pan Democratic Camp in Hong Kong, we can see that majority of the Hong Kong is actually unsupportive of the movement and will not tolerate human rights violation. But under national security law and the new electoral system, voting for those who actually can represent us is not possible anymore. So I don't think people would be interested in voting in that sense.
So if pro-Beijing candidates are all but assured, why does the Communist Party care if people come out to vote or not?
Because the turnout rate of a so-called election is a language that all of the democratic countries speaks. That is, if there's a high turnout rate, then Beijing can create this false sense of legitimacy for themselves and saying that the majority of the Hong Kong people actually support them and want the national security law and want Beijing to intervene so as to bring back prosperity and stability to the city. But with a low turnout rate, this kind of lie cannot stand, and they will not be able to create this sense of illusion that Hong Kongers are actually in support of the law and in support of the Beijing authorities.
Well, police have warned Hong Kongers that it's illegal to urge others not to vote. Are people scared, worried? How are they feeling?
I think there are people who are actually afraid of this kind of threatening because you are not sure about if you say that you're not going to vote, if you do, and the police or authorities have actually arrested people who actually shared this kind of callings on social media saying that they actually violated certain laws in Hong Kong. And so I do understand why people are afraid, but there are still people who said, I don't feel like it's wrong to ask people to not to vote on that day because this is not an election, and still continue to call for that action online. I think as an activist overseas, I think I can't say if they should or should not, but in my personal opinion, I think boycotting is a good thing to do this time.
Iglesias, so many forms of protest are essentially outlawed now. How else do you think Hong Kongers will make their voices heard?
I think there are still a lot of things happening, even though they're not as visible as they were in 2019. For example, last week when Chow Hung-tong, Guan Yitou, and Jimmy Lai were convicted for the Junebird case in 2020, they actually made their mitigation into a speech that's actually conveying political messages, and people are able to read about it even though it doesn't get translated very well into the global community. And at the same time, there are journalists, there are documentary makers, there are a lot of different stakeholders in the society still trying to do their job and still trying to protect the freedom of speech that's left in Hong Kong. So I would say that there are still a lot of things happening, but they're just not as visible as we would see in 2019 and 2020.
And what has Chief Executive Carrie Lam said in the lead up to the vote, and what do you make of her words?
She actually said that there is a chance that people don't go out and vote because they're so content with the government. I think this is just complete nonsense in a way that if citizens would be very eager to vote if they find that those people can actually represent them and play a part in politics that would improve their lives, improve their livelihood. But in this case, we don't actually have that kind of people running in the so-called election that's coming up on Sunday. And then Carrie Lam is just trying to make herself look better, even if the turnout rate is really low this year. She would have to make up excuses and make sure that she doesn't take that blow very harshly in a way, because she will be held accountable by Beijing, because she would be the one who is supposed to be making turnout rate high in Hong Kong, but she would fail definitely.
And finally, Glacia, how will you be marking the election come Sunday from Hamburg?
And for me, I think I will spend Sunday remembering my friends and colleagues who are now behind bars for running in the primary election in 2020. Because I was back in Hong Kong in 2020 helping some of the candidates running their election campaign for the pro-democratic primary and for the actual election that was supposed to happen in September 2020. So the day actually mean a lot to me. I have imagined different versions of an election day in Hong Kong. How would that look like? But none of those imaginations would actually come true anymore, because my candidates are behind bars. And I do hope that the government would release them and we will have genuine democratic elections in the future.
Glacia Kwong, a really important weekend ahead. Thank you so much.
NJ, wow. America, the CDC specifically, may be saying, let's rather look at an alternative instead of using J&J. So for the moment, South Africans saying, or experts, health authorities saying that they are confident in the data they have at hand and will continue using that vaccine in this country.
Now to other news, and the UN says it's receiving credible reports that all sides of Ethiopia's conflict are committing severe human rights violations. It also says an estimated 5,000 to 7,000 people have been detained since last month under the government's state of emergency measures.
The nationwide state of emergency announced on 2 November is leading to significant human rights concerns on a very broad scale. Notably, the state of emergency authorizes the arrest, search and detention of anyone suspected of supporting the Tigray People's Liberation Front and the Oroma Liberation Army, designated terrorist groups in May 2021. This excessively broad provision has led to mass arrests and detentions of thousands of Ethiopians, including United Nations staff, and according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, at least 14 journalists. Most of those arrested are ethnic Tigrayans.
Well, let's go now to our correspondent Malcolm Webb. He's following this from Kenya's capital, Nairobi, and it seems that at least some in the international community are very concerned about the situation in Ethiopia, the ongoing violence. Malcolm.
Indeed, some have expressed concern. It's the European Union that's called for this extraordinary session of the UN Human Rights Council that's going on right now, although we've heard that some of the biggest economies in the EU have actually been quite reluctant. It's other members of the EU that are the driving force behind this. The US State Department has been outspoken about this issue as well. Just last week it was saying it was concerned about reports that Tigrayan forces committed abuses in the Amhara region of Ethiopia. Now the Ethiopian government itself and some of its allies are very much against the setting up of an international commission to investigate rights abuses. It's described what it says as a neo-colonial takeover of the Human Rights Commission of the Human Rights Council to try and interfere with its own sovereignty. It says that it's capable of investigating these abuses and delivering justice domestically, but rights groups say that in spite of promising to do that before, it's failed to do so to date.
And so what could come out of this, Malcolm? What are the chances that this meeting can lead to accountability for the abuses which have been outlined?
For the 47 members in the coming hours, we expect them to vote on whether or not an international commission for Ethiopia, for the conflict in Ethiopia, should be set up. If majority vote against, it won't be set up. Rights groups say that it means that an opportunity will be missed to apply some preventive pressure on actors in this conflict, and they say that means that the people committing these rights abuses will be able to carry on doing so with impunity. On the other hand, if the majority of the members of the Human Rights Council vote in favour, then we can expect an international commission to set up. It will have investigative role, it will publish reports and recommendations, it may have a capacity to preserve evidence of systematic killings and other atrocities allegedly being committed. Rights groups say that will help to prevent further atrocities from taking place, as well as paving the way for possibly one day victims having international support to seek justice for these abuses.
And Malcolm, what are the chances that the government in Addis Ababa would give any international observers
and making it
access
easier
to
for Australian farmers to export goods to the UK? The agreement will also make it easier for young Australians to
Well,
live
the
and work
Ethiopian
in
government is
Britain.
against any
Health authorities are
international
trying to
commission
reassure
being
Australians
set
that they
up,
have
but
more
if
than
one
enough
was to be
booster
set up, you could
vaccines to go
expect it to
around
possibly be
after
something
some
like one that had been
pharmacies
set
and
up
GP
for
clinics ran
other
out this
conflicts
week.
such as in South
With the Omicron
Sudan or in
variant spreading
Syria,
and millions more
and
people
those
are
commissions have
eligible for their
operated
shot.
for the large part
There's been a
remotely.
spike
They've
in
gathered
demand,
evidence
but we're
from
being
afar,
urged
but
not to
nonetheless
panic.
had an important role in documenting things that have been happening. So whether or not they get access, rights groups say isn't the key issue here. They say the key issue at stake today is whether or not this commission actually gets set up in the first place.
Malcolm, thank you very much for that. For now, that is Malcolm Webb with the latest live in Nairobi. Thank you. Now, 11 years ago, a fruit seller in Tunisia set himself on fire in a desperate and fatal act of protest, leading to what became known as the Arab Spring. But more than a decade after the revolution, high unemployment still persists in the country. Tunisians are now marking the day by protesting both for and against the president. Earlier this week, Fayyad called a constitutional referendum for next July, that is a year after he seized broad powers and moves his opponents, called a coup. Well, Elysia Rolfman is joining us live now from the capital, Tunis. Two different demonstrations taking place there, Elysia, but those against the president certainly seem bigger so far.
Yes, they're numbering in their thousands. They've not been allowed to enter Avenue Habib Bourguiba, which is an iconic part of the revolution. It's where people fought and demonstrated for freedom from the authoritarian regime of Ben Ali. So they really want to move up and have their voices heard. What we're seeing is that the Pro-Post supporters are, a few in number. I'm hearing reports that it's only about 100 people or so. And what we have seen in recent polls is that his popularity has fallen. And what we're seeing actually on the streets is that this disparity between those who are angry about Kais Saied's decisions and saying that he has carried out a coup d'etat, and those who support the president, even though, if you believe the reports locally in Tunisia, his popularity is still rising high, and he's determined
vaccinated.
to carry out his
Just weeks after South Korea launched its Living with COVID drive to return to normal life, a surge in cases has seen its government revert back to painful restrictions. The country has one of the world's highest vaccination rates, with more than 80% of the total population double jabbed. Voice of America's William Gallo says that's made the measures even more frustrating.
political regime in Tunisia. What leads in 11 years since the the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring, it seems there these people still protesting things which brought down President Ben Ali 11 years ago. Since Kayside froze the Parliament on the 25th of July. Unfortunately, Tunisia has really suffered from COVID. We saw a massive wave of the Delta variant that really impacted business, and people are really feeling the strike in their pockets. We're seeing a rise in inflation, which in real terms means that food prices are going up and up, and we've seen no end to strikes. So recently we've had strikes in the petrol pumps, and people can't fill up their cars. And over the past 11 years, people are saying that the political class are to blame. This is across the board. Because all they seem to have done, as far as people are concerned, is just to have fights within the Parliament, rather than have some kind of consensus and a political will to change the country for the better and find solutions to the economic problems that have dogged the country. If you remember that in 2011, this was only a few years before Sis attack and the Bardo attack, and that really affected tourism and also the morale of the people. And people want change, but now they had hope in July that Kayside was going to be a force for good, and the squabbling political classes of the Parliament would be shaken up, and that they would see a new step of democracy and a move towards a change that would actually serve the people rather than politicians and the big money of the country.
Olivia, thank you very much for that. And now there is Olivia Volkman for the latest live tuners. Thank you. Now, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is under more pressure after a crushing by-election defeat, representing 12 countries.
While this spectacle rises above the skyline every morning, far below, Doha is bustling with events geared towards attracting tourists ahead of next year.
Well, about a month ago, the South Korean government